Okay, continuing on from the second slide that has basic terms on it. So I gave you some examples of sight translation. I'm trying to think if there's any other situations where you might use that. I don't know. What I will say, because I give all of my classes in person some feedback as far as what you should be doing when you go to take the BEI exam versus what you should do in real life. In a real life scenario, I have had stacks of papers for job trainings and things like that that I've had to sight translate, and you'd better believe that I am doing every possible iteration or possible scenario for these people. Like, for example, with sexual harassment, I'm going to let that deaf person know, okay, it could be one of your fellow employees, it could be your supervisor who's sexually harassing you, it could be this, it could be that, it could be you sexually harassing somebody else, what does sexual harassment mean, and then I'll go through all kinds of possibilities of what that would look like. I mean, I go crazy into detail because I want to make sure that they know what could be misconstrued as sexual harassment, or construed, not misconstrued, and just I want to make sure that they know for their own safety, as well as, you know, I mean, for somebody, you know, trying to sexually harass them, or for them to be sexually harassing other people and not realizing the consequences of that. So I want to make sure that they are in the know. In addition to that, I don't know, it takes a long time. So in real life, I really take my time with sight translation. I try to fully, I don't know, just make sure everything is effectively conveyed. There also may be times in your interpreting where you just do a mini sight translation, where basically the deaf person reads the whole document for themselves, and they kind of look at one thing funny and they point at it to you and say, what does this mean? So you may just be sight translating like a sentence or maybe a word or something like that. I had that happen with a deaf student who she had the word move on her. She was from another country, but she was very intelligent, and all of her hearing peers, it was like a college class, were doing or reading an article and trying to do a summary on it, and it was talking about flamenco dancing and how your body moves to the rhythm, and or moves to the music. And so anyway, she pointed to the word move, and she looked at me, and in sign language she said, move. I thought that meant move, as in like to move from one house to another. And I was like, oh, you're right. And right at that moment, we talk about ethical scenarios in class, you know, right at that moment I had to make a split-second decision. Do I let the teacher tell her what move means, or do I just tell her? And my rule of thumb, and you know, I would dither back and forth on this, but my general rule of thumb is, if I think it's something that every other hearing student would know, and it would make this deaf student look dumb in front of their peers, and it's just something that they probably haven't gotten exposed to, then I'm usually probably going to err on the side of just telling them myself. If I think that it's something that all of them are learning, and other students may even have the same question, and it's something that I think that this person should, you know, be learning with the class, then I'm probably going to let the teacher define it for them. So anyway, in this instant, right or wrong, in this instance, I decided to go ahead and interpret it for them and say, you're right, you know, but it can mean, you know, and so then I did an expansion and explained different meanings of move, the word move. So anyway, again, in that case, it was just a little bit of a sight translation, not an entire document. I go back and forth with doing Vanna whenever there are PowerPoint slides and things like that, or if I'm, you know, whether it's a work training or if it's a class or whatever the case may be. Sometimes I'll just, if I notice that the deaf person is wanting to read what's on the screen, then I'll just let them do that. Sometimes I'll go ahead and sign with it anyway so that they can make a choice as to whether or not they want to look at me or look at that. I've often had it to where the deaf person thought they understood what the English on the screen said, and then when they see me sign it, they're like, oh, I thought it meant something different. You know, and so, I mean, I'm not saying you're a lazy interpreter if you don't interpret what's on the screen, by any means, but I don't know. That would be another form of sight translation. Now, for the actual test, you are timed. I have been told by people who rate the test, the best thing that you can possibly do is, first of all, do not sign like this. Do not put your head down and sign like this. Because, as we all know, facial expressions are paramount in sign language. So, what I would suggest you to do is to skim the document just to get an idea. I don't even mean like read. I mean literally just skim it. Find a few key words and just get a gist of what it's talking about in general. And then I would go probably a few sentences at a time, or maybe a paragraph at a time, or something to that effect, and just kind of get the gist of what the paragraph is saying, or those few sentences. And then, so you kind of look at that, and then you look up and you sign it. And then you look back down, get the gist of the next part, and then you look up and sign it. If by the end you have time to go back and maybe do some more expansions, then I would do that. That's just my personal advice. From the people who rate the test who have talked to me, they've said that, you know, it would be better that you get through the document, because let's say you nail the first 2 paragraphs but you don't finish the rest of the document. Well, they rate things by like having a certain number of points allotted throughout the document. So you may have hit the first 20 points, but if you miss the next 30, I'm making something up, but if you miss the next 30, well then you've missed 30 points. Whereas at least if you made it all the way through the document, you have a better chance of having gotten that. So just FYI, that's my advice for taking the BEI sight translation portion of the performance exam. Dynamic equivalence is the last item on that PowerPoint slide, and dynamic equivalence, you can read about it in the book, but it's also, we've talked about it kind of before, just whenever we're making cultural mediation type things, whenever I'm making sure that the way I'm saying something in English or the way that I'm signing it in ASL is really matching what that person's culture would want me to say. So maybe not being as blunt when I say it in English, maybe using some euphemisms, or vice versa, maybe being a little more blunt in ASL. So one example of dynamic equivalence is if a boss is telling a deaf person, a hearing boss is telling a deaf person, we're going to have to let you go, you know, you've missed too many days of work, blah, 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 blah. If I just say, let you go, or something to that effect, if I do it in a very English format, they may be like, okay, am I off for the day? What's going on, you know? So I would probably say, fire you. I fire you now, or something. I don't know, I'm making that up. But, you know, like I would probably be much more blunt with that deaf person, because that's what they're going to understand. And they may not get the full concept if I don't do that dynamic equivalent message. Anyway, moving on to the next slide. We're going to be talking about interpreters. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and wait and do that on the next video. I want to talk to you guys about the difference between being an interpreter and being a transliterator. One thing that I will say, though, which is true of both, is just a few things. First of all, you are not a deaf interpreter. Okay, there is such a thing as a deaf interpreter, and it's a person who themselves is deaf. There's a deaf interpreter or a certified deaf interpreter, a DI or a CDI, and they actually interpret, and we'll get into this more later in the semester, but maybe they do some sight translation, or they interpret with deaf-blind people, copying from a hearing interpreter, or various other things. And so, copying isn't the right word, but anyway, we'll get into that more. I don't want to get too much into depth about that right now. So just FYI, you are not a deaf interpreter. Also, I hesitate to call myself an ASL interpreter, although usually that's the most, I don't know, that's the clearest you can be. We're really bilingual interpreters, so we're always going to be ASL to English or English to ASL interpreters. But, I mean, you hear people say, oh, she's a Spanish interpreter, and as long as we're all native English speakers, then you recognize that they mean Spanish to English or English to Spanish. So, anyway, just FYI that, you know, I'm a sign language interpreter, that's true, but I'm also an English interpreter. You have to be just as proficient in English as you do at American Sign Language, right? So anyway, I just wanted to add that in for your benefit to know. Yeah, and we'll get into stuff more in the next video. Thanks.